Before I begin, believers and non-believers, I would like to briefly warn you that I am not here to merely entertain you.
I thought you were going to be funny. Come on, be funny.
No, I'm not going to be your monkey.
I am here because I want you, both theists and atheists, to seriously reconsider your current rationale for your arguments and beliefs. And to that extent, I am going to need your participation in this video because I want to demonstrate how and why your intuition is in fierce opposition to an argument which is supposed to be founded upon common sense. I am addressing everyone with this video, so if you don't like considering alternate points of view or you just came here to watch the flickering images and bright pretty colors, then please take this time to find something unconstructive to do with yourself. But for those of you who can suspend your convictions long enough to logically analyze an original proposal, I would like to bring up an issue that has been nagging at me for the last couple of decades. The topic of design comes up in almost every religious debate between skeptics and the faithful, but there are much more fundamental things that are wrong with the intelligent design argument that neither Christian nor atheist, scientist nor layman has yet addressed to any significant degree. My purpose in making this video is to discourage people from ever again mentioning the construction of the human body or the physical universe until they have corrected their understanding of both design and intelligence. To be sure, people have a tendency to be right when they assert that something is intelligently made or that someone has an intellect that is to be admired, but people also routinely show that they don't understand their own criteria for such phenomena, and thus they often propose arguments that are either dubious or self-refuting, and those who spend their time attacking these doomed arguments consistently miss their mark because they themselves are falling for the same fallacy. For instance, I very much disagree with Dr. Dawkins on the issue of designing the designer because his point is a complete non sequitur. He claims that the natural order of things demands that a supernatural entity be more complicated than the thing his existence is supposed to explain away, but with all due respect to the doctor, he does not seem to realize that the natural order of things does not apply to things that aren't natural. To assert to know how complex a supernatural being must be in comparison to anything else goes beyond the point at which any reasonable person can presume to know anything, even if we're merely going by the definitions of invented words. There are two fundamental problems here. First, proving intelligence does not prove omnipotence, and proving that God designed the universe does not prove that he created it. Theists usually seek to prove that there is a consciousness behind the structure of the universe, but they seldom seek to demonstrate that this consciousness is God. They simply assume that their conclusion is supposed to follow the logic of their argument. Secondly, there is a universal means by which we infer intelligence from various situations in our lives, but only in the context of religion do we completely invert that method in order to infer the opposite of what intelligence is, and then inappropriately call it intelligent anyway. Again, skeptics are guilty of this too, by entertaining the notion that design is an otherwise reasonable explanation for the existence of biological mechanisms like DNA and mitochondria. The problem is not, as atheists claim, just that it lacks evidential support, or that instances of poor design can be found, or that science provides viable alternatives to theological explanations for our origins. Of the multitudes of rebuttals that atheists commonly provide, each usually addresses only the phrasing of the original statement and seldom the entirety of the assumptions upon which those arguments are based. People on both sides of the debate routinely treat intelligence and design as though all that were needed to prove their existence was the presence of complexity, purpose, and function, but when has this ever actually been the case? Take the following example. Your boss needs 6 shipments from 6 different vendors, each of which is waiting on their own delivery from their own respective warehouses. Your job is to retrieve the 6 shipments, but you don't know when they're going to be ready. And rather than waiting for a phone call from each vendor indicating that all deliveries are available for a single pickup, your boss wants you to repeatedly drive between all vendors until each package arrives. He suggests that you flip coins in successive tournaments of heads versus tails to decide each new destination, followed by a blind choice round robin to determine which freeway to take to get there. Now, considering the fact that this method will still work, does its complexity demonstrate more or less intelligence on the part of its designer than the previously mentioned alternative? If you think it demonstrates more intelligence, then what would have to change for you to think that it was a nonsensical plan? If less, then under what conditions would you consider it to be a good plan? Think of any of the dumb rules at your job. What do they accomplish, and do they add to or remove complexity from the workplace?
Yeah, Bill, let me ask you a real quick question here. How much time would you say you spend each week dealing with these TPS reports?
Yeah.
Think of the last time you or someone you knew asked themselves, "Why didn't I think of that?" Was the actual solution simpler or more complicated than the one you or they had expected? Was the admonishment a response to a greater or lesser understanding of the situation at hand? When someone asks you to connect the dots in casual conversation, how are you supposed to do it? When arguing with someone over the validity of a proposed explanation for a series of events, what does it mean to connect the dots, and how do you know what a reasonable explanation looks like with respect to the available facts? Let me be more specific. If you had to take a guess between the following 3 examples, which among them would you say best describe the theories of a sensible person, a batshit crazy conspiracy theorist, and your average idiot? Is a sane and intelligent person prone to overly simplistic explanations that manage to avoid all available evidence? Do they produce elaborate explanations of staggering complexity and correlate their points with either non sequiturs and non-pertinent facts, or worse, with statements which are demonstrably false? For a given set of statements that pertain to any given situation, what should a sensible explanation do? I want you to read the following quote and try to see how it relates to cosmic design. Go ahead and pause the video for as long as you need, and when you are ready I will begin the main discussion. Before I delve into the nature of intelligence, I think it is important that you understand a few key things about this topic, so I'm going to start off by relating it to physics. And just so I don't scare anyone off, I don't expect anyone to be a physics major either. But clearly, if you have a heavy object on a shelf, you know that if it falls, it is going to hit something with a large impact. Potential energy refers to the stored energy of an object, and kinetic energy refers to the energy an object has from its motion. What I want you to be aware of is that you cannot directly measure potential energy. If I told you that a ball was to be dropped a given distance, any physics enthusiast could tell you how much work the ball could do if it fell. But this is a derived value. It is calculated, not measured against a standard like distance or volume. And the reason you cannot measure its potential energy is that it is a potential. It relies on assumed conditions matching actual ones, and it relies on a foreknowledge of how those conditions relate to one another. If it weren't for scientists watching things move, we would never have been able to formulate equations to establish what a stationary object could do.
Further and further.
Yet you still closely monitor performance
We have to ensure that people are meeting their potential.
and exceeding it.
No one exceeds his potential.
If he did,
It would simply mean that we did not accurately gauge his potential in the first place.
The same is true of intelligence. The definition of intelligence is the ability to understand something, especially a situation. As a description of potentiality, we cannot measure it directly. What we measure instead is the actual understanding that occurs in a given situation, and we ascribe it to the potential to understand. This may seem like a minor point of contention, but it is important to realize that there is a distinct difference between having intelligence and demonstrating it. This is why there are limits to what can be learned from a given test, and why having a high intelligence does not guarantee that a simple concept will be understood. Further, and because we cannot measure potential directly, we can only treat people the way they behave. As much as it might disturb the scientific community, Stephen Hawking would just be another mute cripple if he couldn't get his ideas out of his head and onto a chalkboard. This often leads us to erroneous assumptions about the capacity of a person's mind, but there isn't anything else we can do about it except for advancing our methods of communication and investigation. With that said, there is a lot I could say about the human brain and how it works. I could go into detail about how our multi-strand memory system informs self-generating weight tables to determine the outcome of neuroplastic events which shape our future predilections to specific types of choices, but all of that would be rather moot in the grander scheme of things. Since the beginning of scientific investigations into the human intellect, it has become increasingly clear that the brain is responsible for the existence of our mental faculties, and as such we have come to think of the brain as a biological machine. It is for this reason that cognitive scientists and neurologists alike rightly pursue explanations for mental abilities by way of functions, because functions are best suited for describing how this machine works. But this approach would be ill-wrought when speaking of supernatural intelligences for the simple fact that we have no reason to believe that a supernatural mind would ever behave like a machine. Moreover, we've been capable of describing both our peers and our best friends as either stupid or intelligent for much longer than we've known about the importance or the function of the brain. What I intend to do then is to use the uncommon common sense to explain the necessary paradox of theism, and to explain why intelligent design is self-refuting. Judging by the comments and feedback I've received from the introduction to this series, it appears that some people misunderstood my intentions with this video collection, so I hope this short insert will adequately clarify my approach. The problem I have with traditional arguments between theists and atheists is that they don't get anywhere. They both know where the other person is going in an argument, but they don't know where they're coming from. They each know how they disagree, but they do not know why. And so most of the arguments and accusatory questions raised by either side have more to do with rallying one's own troops than they do with any attempt to get the opposition to actually think. On the atheist side, we have the repeatedly inept arguments concerning logical paradoxes and the tragic classic of who designed the designer, and on the theist side, we have the ontological, teleological, cosmological, and the moral imperative arguments which seek to bolster the obviousness of God's existence. While some arguments in the public spectrum remain legitimate in their own right, many of the most often repeated claims have not convinced anyone on any side of any position since the dawn of mankind, and yet people continue to use them because those people find solace in the notion that their assertions are supposed to be supportive of their own position, but they are only convincing themselves of a position they already hold. The defining feature of all failed theological arguments, both pro and con, is that they do not account for the human elements of perception. The reason we haven't gotten anywhere in the last couple millennia isn't because we're not looking for God, it's because we're not looking at ourselves. If we are to have any hope of making any progress in this discussion within our lifetimes, we must shift our focus away from the heavens and down to the land of man. Some people have suggested that theism is the result of indoctrination, and others have suggested it is the result of a biological inclination towards beliefs in higher powers. But in the video following the conclusion of this series, I will explain why they're both wrong, or at the very most, only partially right. Without giving away too much right now, I will only explain that both camps of thought are overlooking a key principle of electronics troubleshooting. In the meantime, I will explain how we use our intuitions to assess the intelligence of everything else on the planet, and why this is at odds with any assertion about the design of our universe. Remember, this isn't a disproof of God. This is only an examination of the human intuition and whether or not our universe could ever suggest the existence of such a being. If you're a believer, please keep in mind that I am not claiming that your God either is or is not limited to the laws of logic. It is not my place to say what your personal beliefs are. Nevertheless, I think there are a couple of issues that you need to address on your own, and I would be happy to discuss your conclusions at the end of this series. And to my fellow non-believers, please take diligent notes, because you may find yourself changing your own perspective about a great number of things. So how do we demonstrate intelligence? Well, lucky for us, the etymology and definition tell us exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for discriminating circumstances that establish a situation that must be understood, and actions that reflect an intentional avoidance of a poor choice. In science, the term falsifiability refers to the ability of an explanation to be countered with either real or hypothetical evidence. As a concept, it is useful to science because an explanation is not scientific if it cannot be tested, and an idea cannot be tested if it is unfalsifiable because it cannot fail to explain any amount of contradictory evidence. So given that we cannot measure intelligence, we can only test for understanding and work backwards to determine the potential to understand. As with the concept of falsifiability, in order for a test to exist, failure must be a possible outcome, and thus the limits involved in a situation that establish the possibility of failure are necessary components for demonstrating understanding and the potential for it, because without the possibility of fault or failure, you can test for nothing. Success, on the other hand, is not necessary to demonstrate understanding. If a person does nothing, it might be because they're completely incompetent, or it might be because they're so competent that they realize the futility of the task. So let me state here that design is all a matter of goals and obstacles, and that it is through the obstacle-goal relationship that we evaluate intelligence. The reason I quoted Zhuangzi is that he understood that the obstacle-goal relationship governs all that we think and do, as well as what we know about ourselves. And according to the format of the intelligent design argument, creation falls under the purview of this construct. Even the fact that it is called intelligent design means that we must assume that there is an obstacle-goal relationship at work. Let me explain what I mean. In order to achieve any given goal, a being must have the power to do so. We don't like to dwell on all of the things that we can't do. We don't like to talk about all of the things that we can't have. And lacking omnipotence, we must be able to describe how a being can achieve a goal despite its limitations. Intelligence exists as a word to account for this phenomenon. We invented this word as a means of describing the ability to navigate our way past environmental obstacles to get things done. But humans are not the only beings that have intelligence. So when we think of intelligence tests for other animals, let's say a mouse, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Mazes. But why? Well, as I just explained, the etymology of intelligence indicates that the word is meant to describe situations wherein decisions must be made. Mazes establish the situational constructs under which a mouse must make a decision, and thus we rate the mouse's understanding of the situation by the efficiency with which it gets to the end of the maze, with an acknowledgement of the expected errors that come with the initial ignorance of the maze's layout. Of course, this is where memory becomes a factor in intelligence. In order to know how much ability a person has to understand something, we must know for how long they will be able to learn from their mistakes, and thus the time frame in which you study their behavior becomes important. But for the purposes of this explanation, that is all irrelevant. No matter how many other functions might be necessary for demonstrating understanding, no matter how many other attributes and defining characteristics might be involved, no conscious action makes sense with respect to determining its driving intelligence if you do not know what that being aims to do and why they think their course of action is the most prudent one to pursue. So going back to the maze principle, one can easily ascertain the intelligence of a mouse based on the efficiency with which it reaches the end over successive trials. But as I said earlier, this is all dependent on whether or not the observer has accurately determined the goal involved. If you set up an obstacle course for your dog at home and he stops halfway through to lick his balls, that doesn't necessarily mean that your dog is retarded. It could very well be that licking his balls was simply higher on his agenda than hanging out with you. The crux of the matter is that we do not base intelligence on complexity. This is an association fallacy. We base intelligence on simplicity with respect to the obstacles that force our designs to be complex. We design things because we are limited. We demonstrate intelligence because we are limited. If there were no obstacles to any given goal, then the simplest route would remain the smartest thing to use, regardless of how much or how little intelligence it actually took to get there.
No, I get into those arguments all the time. All the time. Friends of mine will be like, well, how come anytime a black athlete does something, they say it's an athletic move? Anytime a white athlete does it, they say it's an intelligent move. And it's like, well, fair enough, man. It just depends on what you're doing. You know what I mean? It's like, if you read a defense, white or black, that's an intelligent move, right? But if you take off from the foul line, jump over 9 other dudes, and throw the shit down, those other 9 guys aren't standing there like, fuck, why didn't I think of that shit? Here I am dribbling around, guys. I think that's some superhero shit. Shit like a cape flapping in the wind with a big S on your chest.
So long as the power to achieve a goal exists, intelligence is almost entirely irrelevant, save for the acknowledgement that the goal exists in the first place by striving to achieve it. If you understand this and you agree with me, then in all honesty, you can skip to the end where I explain the necessary paradox and why the intelligent design argument has to exist. I will also explain why atheists should abandon the who designed the designer argument altogether and what question we should be asking instead. If you do not agree with me, or if you just want a better understanding of the civilization around you, then I strongly urge you to continue watching. So I just explained how mazes work, but the obstacle-goal relationship doesn't just work on the physical level, it also works in the abstract. In the movie Donnie Darko, fraudster Jim Cunningham markets a self-help seminar that uses emotional appeals to convince its participants that they've been freed from the tyranny of their own insecurities. Let's watch as an avid follower of his work propagates his reductionist approach to the human condition and observe the response from the protagonist of the story.
Ling Ling finds a wallet on the ground filled with money. She takes the wallet to the address on the driver's license but keeps the money inside the wallet. I'm sorry, Miss Farmer, I don't get this.
Just place an X on the lifeline in the appropriate place.
No, I mean, I know what to do. I don't get this. You can't just lump things into 2 categories. Things aren't that simple.
The lifeline is divided that way.
Well, life isn't that simple. I mean, who cares if Ling Ling returns the wallet and keeps the money? It has nothing to do with either fear or love.
Fear and love are the deepest of human emotions.
Okay, but you're not listening to me. There are other things that need to be taken into account here, like the whole spectrum of human emotion. You can't just lump everything into these 2 categories and then just deny everything else.
If you don't complete the assignment, you'll get a 0 for the day.
When engaging in a discussion aimed at productive conclusions, the goal is not to simply form an explanation. What a proponent of an idea must do in order to establish credibility is form an explanation that is consistent with the available facts. Reality, as it usually does, becomes the limiting factor in the amount of simplicity that an intelligently constructed thing can have. We live in a world full of facts, but facts cannot interpret themselves. Participants in a given debate therefore demonstrate their intellect not only by laying out clear and cogent positions, but also by being able to justifiably discern pertinent facts from non-pertinent facts. The debate ensues when there is a contest over whose facts are more worthy of consideration and in what way they fit into the puzzle. That different people subjectively ascribe varying amounts of significance to different facts to arrive at opposing conclusions is irrelevant to my argument here. What is important is to recognize that each of their fact sets are objectively present and paramount according to each advocate's respective views, and thus the obstacle-goal relationship is maintained. Take, for instance, the vaccination debate between alternative medicine and science-based medicine. In DeRoy Light's video series, Why People Ignore Vaccine Denialists, he aptly mentions that one of the favorite tactics of the denialist is to point out that smallpox deaths increased after government-mandated vaccination policies were put into place. This is a fact, and as such, it does provide a significant hurdle for any uneducated science advocate who would otherwise champion the administration of vaccines. So how does DeRoy Light address this issue? Well, he provides additional information from verifiable sources which independently explain the sudden spike in smallpox deaths as being the result of the anti-vaccination movement itself, which spread fear and instructed people on how to circumnavigate the law. And then he goes one step further to explain what the anti-vaccinators cannot: the sudden drop in deaths that immediately followed the closing of those very same legislative loopholes. Clearly, associating pertinent data points along specific lines of reasoning makes the argument more clearly defined, and prevents alternate explanations from being considered with equal merit, due to the unnecessary complexity that such an argument would have to adopt in order to remain tenable. The simplest remaining explanation becomes the best and most convincing one so long as it accounts for all registered and future data without resorting to non sequiturs or irrelevant information. For the reasons previously mentioned, you cannot gauge a mouse's intelligence in a vacuum, so you impose limitations and provide incentives in order to gather the information you need. In order to increase the effectiveness of your test, you increase the number of limits. In the engineering world, it is not the limits we increase, but the goals. But since reality determines the limits we face with respect to our goals, we generally do see an increase in limits as we increasingly shoot for the stars. We have never been able to break the laws of the universe. What we do instead is work around them in order to achieve our ends, and each new puzzle requires a new innovative change in our thinking, an alteration of course and direction in our thought process. With each scientific discovery and mistake, we acquire a greater understanding of the obstacles before us, so that we can devise the shortest route to our next destination. Our collective intelligence is therefore evidenced by our ability to demonstrate our useful knowledge of our situation by overcoming past engineering conundrums and efficiently dealing with future ones that have similar characteristics to the ones we've encountered before. But complex problems often require complex solutions, and thus people often mistake mere complexity for design. That does not mean, however, that we have ever deviated from using simplicity in design as a measure of one's intelligence. Anyone in the technical industry can tell you that an engineer can create a complex solution to a complicated problem, but a good engineer will create a simple solution to a complicated problem. The only time a complex design is used over a simple one is when function, reliability, cost, or another mitigating factor must be taken into account. This preference for simplistic efficiency is known in science as the principle of parsimony. It is used because it makes the most sense, and it is recounted to remind scientists and engineers to maintain their focus. This preference for ease and simplicity is not a matter of laziness. It wasn't out of laziness that we decided to develop the space program. Nevertheless, as we have progressed in our knowledge of the difficulties of space travel, we have continually streamlined our processes and refined our techniques. What once seemed impossible is now so mundane that only space enthusiasts even pay attention anymore.
How many launches are there in a day? A dozen? You're the only one who watches every one of them. If you're going to pretend like you don't care, don't look up.
We should intuitively know that the real challenge to be had in any situation is to simplify it, because the quintessential outside-the-box experiment shows that people are only prone to increase the complexity of their designs when they don't know how else to solve their problems. Incidentally, there is a type of device which intentionally breaks the principle of parsimony. It is called a Rube Goldberg machine, and it can serve many different functions because its goals are not the same of that of general science or engineering. If you want a glass of water, you take a glass and you fill it with water. If you make a Rube Goldberg machine to fill your glass for you, you might be doing so for any number of reasons, ranging from proof of academic accomplishment to personal amusement to having something to do while you contemplate what it's like not to have a girlfriend. But the obstacle-goal relationship remains intact because the full glass of water was not the primary goal. But again, the fundamental problem here is that complexity and function are not what determines intelligence. Intelligence is determined by the relative ease and simplicity of achievement that comes with the ultimate understanding of that which prevents something from otherwise being easy or simple. Or to put it more clearly, the goal of intelligence is simplicity, not complexity. It is by absolutely no accident that the masters of any given craft make their work look easy, because that is precisely and exactly the whole point of employing gained knowledge and experience in the first place. Utilizing information in an intelligent manner towards a goal makes the goal easier and simpler to achieve by construct of the language we use to define intelligent behavior. In fact, even the act of analyzing something is supposed to be highly discriminatory in order to remove extraneous information for ease of understanding. Dr. Roger Shepard argues that one of the basic functions of intelligence is the ability to classify, because classification is a necessary biological function, whether it is to find edible food or escape hazardous environmental conditions. He breaks down survival-based categorization into 3 categories, each of which addresses an appearance perception problem which requires intelligence in order to overcome the obstacle. The obvious result here is that an analysis need only be as complex as the thing being analyzed, and anything beyond that is deemed over-analysis. That is generally a bad thing because it breeds ambiguity and indecisiveness that gets in the way of practical progress. Inadvertent over-analysis is not a failure of excessive intellect, but rather a failure of not having enough intellect to attain an understanding of the situation at hand. The only reason you would intentionally over-analyze a situation is when someone else doesn't get it. In this case, you explain to them all the options, and you address each one until they understand the full nature of the dilemma they face so that they can find their own way out. That's all clinical therapy really is. People who have troubled dysfunctional lives usually have traumatic childhoods. The root causes of their problems are often simple in nature. The complexity comes from the myriad coping mechanisms that mask the underlying issues that haven't been dealt with. The role of the psychologist, when it comes down to it, is really just to point out the obvious at a time in which the patient is most vulnerable and receptive to external input.
Oh my God, I've never thought about it like that. Oh my God, I've never thought about it like that. That's brilliant. Every time I act out.
Every time.
Oh, brilliant.
Put him through it again.
Oh my God. It's as simple as that, isn't it?
It is always said that there is a great irony to be found in the fact that the most arrogant people of this world are often the least qualified. But if you're a subscriber to this position, I think you should re-examine the situation. Simple minds do often tend to oversimplify their problems, and, for the reason that their solutions are simpler, they believe that they are smarter than the people they disagree with. But the problem in these cases is not that the stupid person is attempting to simplify the situation, but rather that they don't have all the facts, they don't grasp the intent of the discussion, or they disregard the meaningful rules that people intentionally seek to uphold. For instance, the abortion issue is not an inherently complicated one in terms of its base components. Were we to only focus on silencing the debate, all we'd have to do is imprison anyone who disagreed with the majority. But instead, we allow the situation to become complex because we value the ability to achieve reasonable compromises wherein everyone's human rights are ensured, and anyone who doesn't value that is what we call an asshole. But I mean, really ask yourself, what is a teenager but a person who doesn't yet have an appreciation for all of the limits and obstacles we face as adults, and whose solutions are ingeniously simple to the best of their knowledge? In turn, we often congratulate ourselves for our own intellect in arriving at a simple conclusion that teenagers are idiots, and thus we have a tendency to dismiss a teenager's antics by merely accusing them of hubris. But their arrogance is not a character flaw. They are using the same standard of judgment that we are, and you should well know how unsatisfying it is to conceive of a simple solution to a problem, only to be dismissed by someone who says that you don't know how things really work. To say that teenagers are merely throwing a tantrum whenever they disagree with you is to fail to realize what's really going on, and to fail to understand why you should deal with them by taking them seriously and finding the time to educate them on the limits that they are currently unaware of. So why is Jesus considered to be the greatest purveyor of truth among the Christian community? Because he uses simple parables to convey an understanding of the complicated nature of man, and thus Christians believe he efficiently sets forth valuable guidelines for healthy living. Einstein and Newton were both responsible for using complicated mathematical proofs to derive their theories about the behavior of the natural world, but the reason their solutions were so complex is because they had to corroborate their mathematics with a complicated physical world that existed external to them. Look at 1984, Lord of the Flies, The Great Gatsby. They are written at the 4th grade level, and yet they convey brilliance and significance to those who understand their meaning and intent, because they efficiently address the complexity of world history and the human experience. You can see this again in modern mythology and storytelling. Not only do great sagas speak to the human condition in ways that ring true to us by hearkening back to classic character flaws and archetypes, but we even know of the natures of the characters themselves by the boundaries by which they do or do not abide. When we are used to a figure producing amazing results, it is so easy for us to imagine a supernatural connection that we refer to them as technical wizards. But the difference between magic and genius is all in whether or not we know or believe that these people have accomplished their feats by finding or by creating their routes to success. And whenever we don't see a montage to highlight the limits they've overcome through hard work rather than supernatural convenience, we are perhaps a little too free to assume that the deus ex machina of the story actually involved a divine element rather than just a stretch of the imagination.
When your condition worsened after the first day.
I analyzed your blood, isolating the receptor compounds and the protein-based catalyst.
I may not understand any of that.
Not at all. I just wanted you to know how hard it was.
Now you might protest that the obstacle-goal relationship doesn't apply to other things like artistic genius, but I think it does. I come from a family of fairly talented artists, and I think I can safely say that most painters aim to express themselves in such a way as to share ideas and invoke contemplation in the minds of their audiences by producing something interesting. This simply cannot be done with a blank canvas, and that is why complexity arises in painting. There are facets of human psychology at work which determine how we define and interpret art, and like the laws of the universe, these facets are largely outside of our conscious control because most of our brain's interpretive functions are exceedingly automated, as multitudes of tests can show.
We'll try it right now. I'll give you a list of words. With each word, simply name the color in which it's printed, ignoring what the word says. Okay? We'll start off. Red, black. Easy. Okay? Now try it again. Same instruction. Name the color in which the word is printed. Much, much harder. The explanation is that to a literate adult, reading is automatic. You can't process a written word as a squiggle, even if you try to. The meaning always gets through despite your best intentions.
Now, there are many different methods of accomplishing the feats of inducing fascination and igniting inspiration, and with them have come different schools of art as we know it. Many artists start off by wanting to share or express an image or an interpretation of an experience or vision. Since most images are themselves complex, it is no surprise to us that the resultant painting must also be complex. If the goal is to accurately depict a face, then one must include the nose, the eyes, and mouth, etc. But again, there are different methods of doing things. Impressionist painting, for example, actually bypasses some of the need for the complexity of an image. Rather than fully representing the nose, the eyes, and the mouth of a person, an impressionist sometimes manipulates the paint in such a way as to fool your brain into seeing a full face that isn't actually there. The skill of an impressionist painter is not displayed by his or her ability to reproduce a photographic image of a scene, but to produce a collage of abstract shapes which effectively combine to create a cohesive image in your mind based on your interpretation of the collective components. While the photorealist painter must understand optics and physical form, an impressionist must understand something much more complex, the human perception of vision. In fact, most people attribute the Impressionist movement with being the first of its kind to demonstrate an understanding of the optical illusion of shadows by portraying what we seem to see rather than what logically makes sense. And we can go even more abstract than that, into, well, abstract art. Clearly, one of the most famous of abstract painters was Picasso, but do you think anyone actually believed that Picasso had a clinical brain disorder which limited his visual understanding of reality to triangles and squares? Of course not. So then why would he paint people the way he did? But that's just it. Therein lies the accomplishment. With a simplistic image, he efficiently and effectively caused people to ask this very question, to be perplexed at his work, to spend time considering the images before them. His work attracts the sort of people who enjoy the challenge of trying to solve the riddle of what made Picasso tick. And what is most striking about this situation is that regardless of whether or not people understand the intent of abstract art, both groups employ the same general standard measure of design. Those who gain pleasure from the puzzles posed by this genre of art see Picasso as a revolutionary and a genius for being able to so efficiently achieve the final goal of forcing the audience to perceive things differently, while those who do not see the goal as being met think he's a moron and an overrated member of high art. To them, his work was not interesting. To them, Picasso's work was thus unnecessarily complex because every stroke of his brush was a waste of both his time and theirs. The literary arts are no different. Language is the foremost indicator of intellect that we have on this planet because we are not telepathic, and because language is the primary means by which we communicate our most intricate ideas. By construct, in order for a word to retain meaning, its definition must be consistent between two speakers of any given language, or else miscommunication is going to occur. It is for this reason that we have dictionaries. Every word in the English language, by definition, has a definition. When you use a word in place of its definition, you are using the transitive property of mathematics to substitute a single word for the dozens of associated thoughts contained within that single word. You could do the reverse ad infinitum by expanding every word into its definition, but you don't. You consolidate your sentences to convey the meaning behind your ideas, because without meaning, the words would have no purpose and their use would not be a demonstration of intelligence. But every word exists within a larger continuum of cultural uses and applications, and so in addition to its definition, many words gain an additional layer of contextual meaning, known as a connotation. By utilizing additional layers of meaning, a poet will further simplify and condense their thoughts into very small or very few words. Poetry is the act of conveying complexity through simplicity, and like the dot experiment, it plays not on the words themselves, but on the gaps that they create. At the beginning of this series, I quoted a famous psychologist who stated that you cannot understand the human mind without looking at its two constituent parts, that being both the brain and its environment, at the same time. The reason I think the obstacle-goal relationship is so effective as an explanation of intelligence is that it accounts for this dichotomy between the internal and external components. Without them, we can know nothing of the situation at all. And yet, surprisingly, people do not consciously understand this. People intuitively know when a person is a genius or adult, and people intuitively understand that the mouse which consistently and successfully navigates different mazes after the fewest trials must be the smartest of the bunch. But I positively guarantee that if you ask a layperson on the street to explain the theory behind it, to require them to take more information into account in the pursuit of a greater understanding of the underlying phenomenon, they will painfully stumble through an excessively verbose response and may very well miss the point altogether. But our intuitions are not infallible either. Clearly, people still form association fallacies, and the one I am highlighting here is so pervasive that even non-believers entertain them. So what is the necessary paradox? Well, before I can explain why it is necessary, let me explain the paradox itself. If you've followed me up to this point, two things should be readily apparent. First, it is not possible for a thing to be so complicated that it had to be designed, because that's not what design is, and that's not how intelligence works. It is either as reasonably simple as it can be for the task at hand, or else it isn't the product of understanding. Second, it is not possible to demonstrate infinite intelligence and infinite power at the same time, because the requisite conditions for the perception of their existence are mutually exclusive. So to say that God has demonstrated infinite intelligence by designing an infinitely complex universe is only to say that he is infinitely limited. But a God who is infinitely limited is not a God. It would be demonstrably false to say that God had to use anything so complex as DNA in order to make biological life possible, and yet that is exactly the position required to make an intelligent design argument feasible or convincing. Think about it. The same people who say that God is omnipotent and unknowable are the same people arguing to know God's intent with the universe and what it took for him to make it work. Even if we followed them to the conclusion of their desires, they would still be missing all two of the two components necessary for an intelligent design argument, and yet that is the name of the argument they use to support their belief. And though many skeptics have provided great rebuttals to assertions about the universe being finely tuned, they repeatedly overlook the fact that the bestest proof of these statements lie within these statements themselves. The argument that the universe is finely tuned is based on the idea that God doesn't have any control over some aspects of our physical reality. The verb to tune means that there are standards that exist external to the operator, and the only use for such a word is for situations in which we have only limited control. If your guitar produced every sound you ever wanted without any adjustment, you would never have to tune it. By declaring that you do need to tune it, you are saying that it is not possible for your guitar to play every sound you desire, and that it takes intentional active adjustment to bring it to its proper settings for a given task. You do not decide what frequency your favorite radio station operates at, and that is why you have to tune your radio to a requisite frequency of the electromagnetic spectrum to hear your favorite songs. Tuning cannot, by definition, take place when obstacles to a goal do not exist, when an action doesn't need to be performed. There would be no adjustment if no adjustments were necessary, and unnecessary adjustments cannot qualify for the definition of tuning because a causal relationship has to exist in order for an adjustment to cause correctness. And yet God is supposed to have been the author of what is possible and what is required. He shouldn't have to adjust the universe like an aftermarket automotive accessory in order to cause harmony to exist within its boundaries. If you accepted that the universe didn't need to be finely tuned in order to work, then it would be a moot point and you would never bother bringing it up. But if God had to tune the universe in order to make it work, if he cannot play the universe out of tune, then he doesn't have creative license, which means he isn't the creator. You should find it exceedingly ironic that the one condition you think most proves the existence of an omnipotent being is the one in which indicates he is the most limited. That there isn't a single cosmological constant in all the universe that he couldn't adjust without disastrous results, as if one should worry about the stability of their house of cards when it is they who decides the property of gravity. But here is the crux of the matter. This is the point I want to make to you. We cannot expect anything different. The paradox is not that theists attempt to substantiate the existence of a limitless being by describing its limits. It is that this is the only possible scenario for a person who incorrectly believes that complicated things are necessarily the result of intelligence. Intelligence exists as a word, as a concept, as an explanation for the accomplishment of goals despite limitations. We only know a thing is intelligent when it is limited, and the only way to know how intelligent a person is to further limit them with a test. Even when a person enters into a contest by which they are pitted against the wits of another person, they must submit to the rules of the game or adhere to some sense of logic if they wish to be lauded for their efforts. But we also only know of the existence of consciousness when a thing demonstrates intelligence. The acknowledgement of consciousness presupposes the existence of the internal-external dichotomy of mental motivation amid pre-existing circumstances. Any attempt at a logical justification for the existence of a creator God must inherently involve the contradictory positions that the God is both limited and not limited at the same time. Let me say that again. Any attempt at a logical justification for the existence of a creator God must inherently involve the contradictory positions that the God is both limited and not limited at the same time. I swear to you that if you go back through any significant argument with any creationist you've ever had in your entire life, you will find half a dozen claims about what God can't do and how his choosing a certain action instead of another allowed a preferable outcome. And most of those people will also say that God exists beyond logic. You see, the problem that creationists are trying to avoid here is the acknowledgement that when no limits are available and no goals are known, unintelligent actions are indistinguishable from intelligent ones because you are operating in an absence of discriminating circumstances and objectives. When that happens, it becomes increasingly difficult to justify the notion that a supernatural consciousness exists because such a thing requires intelligence as a fundamental property. What theists predictably try to do then is to substantiate the existence of the consciousness by attempting to prove that intelligence is required to formulate a universe, and from that position they argue that intelligence has been demonstrated, ergo, evidence for God. But of course in doing so, they only demonstrate their own lack of understanding of how we assess the presence of power or intellect in the first place, and the differences between demonstrations of power and intellect are perfectly described by the obstacle-goal relationship, a relationship that simply demands simplicity. Again, this isn't an isolated phenomenon, it is how we think. It is why we have Occam's razor, it is why we have the principle of parsimony, it is why we say work smarter, not harder, it is why we aim to hit two birds with one stone wherever possible. Great minds think alike because when all relevant limits are known and agreed upon by all parties involved, there is usually only one simplest solution. Even when someone aims to be unpredictable as they are in combat, comedy, and games of strategy, complexity only arises where it is beneficial. Complexity in strategy only exists because of the limits that are acknowledged by warriors and generals who understand the value of surprise and the impediment of predictability. And as with all simplistic approaches to success, the difference between genius and foolishness in applying straightforward tactics such as the blitzkrieg is a fine line that is only retrospectively determined by the authors of history. But Dawkins' assessment of the situation isn't any better than the creationists. People demonstrate intelligence whenever they pass a rigorous exam that requires putting learned information into context. But we never ask who printed your teacher. We know where the teacher comes from. We know that they were once a student who demonstrated enough understanding to become an instructor, after which time they began applying limitations to their students so their students could demonstrate their ability to grasp the course material, and so on and so forth. But it does not make any sense to ask who wrote your exam writer. Just because you can turn a noun into a verb and repeat it in a sentence doesn't mean you should. The question we should ask is not who designed the designer, but rather who is testing them, who is causing them to be limited such that the creation of a universe is a demonstration of intelligence. You see, I do not have to design a mouse in order to invent the maze that causes it to be limited. The test remains valid regardless of the age of the mouse or its origin. Telling me that the mouse is eternal does not answer my question because I am not asking where it came from, and I don't care how long it's been here. But remember, it is possible that God is limiting himself, so the two possible answers are that he is either limiting himself or else he is limited by someone or something else external to him. So let's be generous and consider the possibility that God brought these limitations upon himself, like playing by the rules of chess rather than knocking the pieces around. Well, why would God ever want to do this? As I already pointed out, that would be counterproductive. If God wants us to worship him for being God, then we should worship that about him that makes him God. You know, his godliness. Proving that he is intelligent requires that he limit himself. But by limiting himself, he takes from himself that which makes him greater than us. I mean, how are we supposed to know that he's the ringleader when he's the one jumping through the hoops? Not to mention that this entire discussion comes from our inability to measure ability. If God is the creator of the universe, if there were no laws to govern the universe before there was a universe to govern, then the laws of logic we know today are utterly worthless in terms of describing what God can or cannot do. So if God wants us to know of his infinite power and his infinite intellect at the same time, all he has to do is create a simple universe and then give us an intelligence measuring cup or a yardstick of wit. So long as we can measure his intelligence without him having to demonstrate it, the universe could be simple and he would hit two birds with one stone. We would know the two things that would otherwise be impossible to know within a complex universe. And that would be the smartest thing he could ever do. Of course, some people are going to protest that if the universe were simple or perfect or both, that the universe would be boring or without purpose. Needless to say, there are clear problems with assuming to know what God thinks, and even more so in assuming to know how God thinks. But if we are to presume that the human sense of engineering can lend any insight into God's creations, then there really is only one reasonable conclusion. As I mentioned earlier, the output of a Rube Goldberg machine is never the reason for such a machine's existence. So if God decided to make biology complex when he could have made it simple, you would have to conclude that biological life was not his goal. Add to that the notion that things like cancer are the result of free will, as if 8-year-old girls can't help but die because of what 15-year-old boys do with themselves at night. And it becomes increasingly absurd that God's goal was a robust, functional system that just so happens to fall apart at the seams when people think naughty thoughts. So now let's take the final step and discuss the implications of a God who is limited by something external to himself. Human thinking often takes the chronological approach, and so as often as people spend time talking about God in the afterlife, the majority of the arguments for his existence come not from what happens after we're here, but before. The question of where did everything come from pervades every religious discussion with a non-believer, and the greatest asset of the modern theist is their ability to misunderstand what the Big Bang Theory says. But let's pretend for a moment that despite the layman's scientific ignorance, that the Big Bang Theory really did say that something came from nothing, and that logic showed that only omnipotent intervention could result in such an occurrence. Well, if God is limited by something external to himself, if there are limits that he must abide by that govern his ability to interact with his environment, then he is not the omnipotent entity you seek with your line of reasoning. If anything, intelligent design would only show that the creator and the designer were separate entities, and at least that would make more sense in the grander scheme of things. Anyone who's ever played a game of asshole knows that it is far easier to make the rules than it is to abide by them, and the existence of a more supreme being would at least give us a justifiable reason to praise God for his intelligence in devising anti-cancer genes while taking pity on his inability to prevent the need for anti-cancer genes. Of course, if that were the case, God would lose all of his explanatory power. When you ask the question, where did I come from, you remove your parents from the equation because you are seeking a deeper answer to the original inquiry, and your parents are only an intermediate step along the way. The same is true for your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and so on. So if God is not omnipotent, if he isn't the thing that causes himself to be limited, then we must ask who is, and then you fall back into the problem of infinite regress that God was supposed to resolve in the first place. Again, you might have easily answered the question of God's origins by declaring his eternal nature, but you have not addressed the question of why the universe should be complex when the goal of intelligence is to strive for simplicity. But there is a third option. Remember that according to creationists, this is all supposed to be a common sense issue. But if we are to honestly discuss whether or not God exists by observing nature, and in addition to not knowing whether or not God does exist, we also don't know what his intentions would be or what limits he might face, then we cannot assume design, much less the intelligent variety. What if, as in the case of the rabbit snare, we have been discarded and God has already gotten what he was after? What if you were just right to begin with, and he really is mysterious, and the only reasonable position is one that is agnostic towards design? And here's what really aggravates me. If you wait long enough in any given argument between a believer and a non-believer, you will invariably come across this exchange.
I mean, this is another thing. I mean, there are various interesting paradoxic states in the universe. And it's like, well, when it just... It's infinitely powerful. Why not just...
Well, you might say, why did he take 6 days? I don't know. I'm not God. I can't figure out why I sipping 28 capsules of saliva every day.
But if you're like, this is, well, yeah, but why you drink 28 capsules of saliva or something you can actually analyze.
You're going to enjoy talking to Scotty.
Yeah.
Over lunch. Scotty's coming to lunch with us? Yeah. I'm paying, okay?
Okay.
There are two glaring problems here. First, the original question is an entirely valid one, and it shouldn't be casually abandoned because it pertains to the very nature of the being in question. You atheists always ask the question of why God would do such and such, and you know it's not a rhetorical question. So stop acting like it is by letting everyone off the hook when they change the subject. And when the other person invariably gives the reply, I don't know, then you should take the time to point out that they have no basis for their claim because they are missing all two of the two components necessary for the argument, thus leading us to question if they even really have criteria for the terms they use. And theists, please do not take this to mean that I disrespect your position, but there is a great difference between saying that you know that God is not limited and that you don't know if he designed the universe. And it is quite another to say that you know that he designed the universe and that you don't know if he is limited. If I told you that a dark car drove by me and that I didn't know if it was technically black, you would have no reason to question my judgment. But if I told you that a black car drove by and that I didn't know if it was technically dark, you would invariably realize that something was amiss. When your own assertions lead to situations where you suddenly become agnostic about requisite conditions for your own position, you should immediately go back and figure out exactly what it is that you think you should be trying to prove. And so the next time you appreciate a complicated thing that is verifiably designed, please do so with a healthy respect for the obstacles that caused it to be complex. Appreciate the engineer for his or her insight and praise them because they are not gods.